So the policy launch date, we are aiming for a launch in July 2020 this year. And by official launch date, what we mean is the date that the policy comes into effect. The policy was announced, that happened on Monday, but the period between now and the official launch, the policy is not in effect. We're basically just trying to give as much time as possible for people to become familiar with the policy, to ask questions about it, for us to, be able to develop resources, etc. We're not giving an exact date for launch yet. As I said, July is the target, but that is dependent on us being able to implement a single declaration of interest entry point to support policy implementation. So as many of you will know now, authors fill out declarations of interest forms in Archie, but then they also need to make a declaration in RevMan. So what we would like to do is create a single DOI entry point to support policy implementation, make that easier for the authors. And we're also aware that the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors have proposed a revised declaration of interest form. So that's quite timely, and how they've revised that form may be something that we would be interested in adopting. But putting these two things together, we're still aiming for July, but once we have a firm date, that will be communicated with plenty of notice. So because it's very, very important to understand that we are not applying the 2020 policy retrospectively. So the 2020 policy will apply to all new Cochrane titles that were registered after, I'm saying July 2020, but whatever that official launch date is, I'll just say July. So titles registered after July 2020. It also covers reviews where the update begins after July 2020. It does not include, what's not covered, what remains under the 2014 policy is anything where the title, any cases where the title was registered, or a protocol was underway, or had already been published, or the review was underway, or an update was already underway. All of that, if work was underway before July 2020, then the 2014 policy applies. You aren't expected to apply the 2020 policy. And we have a visual representation of that. So the rollout, if we go with July, is the vertical line. So in blue is the 2014 policy. So on the top row, TR for title registration, PP protocol publication, and RP review publication. So if all of that activity happened before the July 2020 launch date, then all of that review is under the old policy. There's no expectation that comes under the new policy until we update, which is over on the other side of the policy launch line. If in the second row, if the title was registered and the protocol was published, but the review hadn't yet been published, it's still under the old, it's still under the 2014 policy, and not until it comes time for update would we expect the 2020 policy to be applied. And it's the same for, even if the title was only registered, but the protocol hadn't been published nor the review, there isn't an expectation that you'd have to assemble a new author team which complies with the 2020 policy. That case there also falls under the 2014 policy. And then finally, anything that's once a title is registered or an update begins after launch, then that's when the 2020 policy applies. So I mentioned that we have made clear the responsibilities for various groups of Cochrane members. Firstly, authors have to provide timely, accurate, consistent declarations throughout the review life cycle. That's their responsibility, and that's set out clearly. And as I said, I think authors are a key target group for us who we haven't really reached out to before about this policy, and I think it's important that we do. Cochrane review groups should not allow a title to be registered unless it complies with the new policy. This is after launch, obviously. And also, if an update is going ahead after the new policy, then it's also the CRG's responsibility to ensure that that update team complies with the new policy, and that may mean a change. And that goes back to Jamie's point and also Carla's point that we will be able to support when it comes to communicating with authors about that change and the way it impacts them at update stage. And the editorial and methods department is responsible for checking other Cochrane Library content. So for making sure that the editorials comply with the policy and that Cochrane Clinical Answers authors comply with the policy. So in this implementation period between now and when the policy goes live, so to speak, we have already put together that we've got a small research integrity team, small as in 2 people. I've already mentioned Lisa, who's the senior research integrity editor, and she will be joined by a research integrity editor who will start with us in May, I believe, and with other that research integrity team will work alongside other EMD staff, and I've mentioned, and that's basically the people. Most of the people are on this call, so that's me and Graham and Maria. And we're forming the COI implementation team. We also have an implementation working group, because one of the things we know is that there are several dependencies with other CET departments. So for example, our IT department, our knowledge translation department in terms of communications, and also our people services department, because we're working very closely with the training teams who are based who work with people services department. We have developed a web page where all COI policy information is going to go. So I'll say a bit more about that in a second, but at the moment it includes, there's a certain amount of information there already, but including the 2014 policy and the 2020 policy. We're going to develop more supporting materials, and we're going to run more training events in this kind of implementation period. So there's this webinar today, which we had kind of really disseminated or advertised mainly to CRGs, because as the kind of group of members who are probably most impacted by this policy, we wanted to run this webinar first with you, but we will be running an introductory webinar which will advertise more widely for the wider Cochrane community on June the 10th. We did have some face-to-face training organised. We were going to talk to coordinating editors in Manchester at the governance meeting, and to managing editors in Dublin at the UK and Ireland symposium. But of course, with the current COVID-19 pandemic, both those events have been cancelled. So we're aware that in this period we're going to need to do more introductory webinars, more virtual training, and we'll be working on that in the next few weeks. We're also really happy to do targeted training. So next week I'll be speaking, or no, the week after I'll be talking at a couple of the network meetings. If there are other networks who would like an opportunity to ask questions about the policy or see a brief presentation, we're really happy to do that. And if there and other groupings within Cochrane, information specialists, managing editors, we're happy to do targeted bespoke training. Post policy launch, we will continue with webinars as needed. We'll kind of go one step at a time on that. We have submitted a workshop proposal for Toronto, so hopefully we will all be able to make it to Toronto, given the current situation globally, but we have submitted a proposal. In terms of the kinds of resources that we want to develop and make available through that COI portal, where we're going to work with the training team from People Services Department to develop an online learning module that's based on COI scenarios. Webinars like these will be recorded and made available. We want to set up some FAQs, a decision flow chart. We've thought about maybe doing an annotated policy guide, which sort of points out in the new policy what's new and what's changed. We want to make available more information about the how to refer cases and what the appeals process is. And also, People Services Department would like to integrate the policy and information about the policy into staff induction packages. If you have any other ideas about the kinds of training or things that would help you, we'd be very, very pleased to hear them. And finally, we have a URL for the portal, quite simple, conflictofinterest.cochrane.org. And we have a central email, the COI arbiter at cochrane.org. Now, so if that is the central contact point, if people have a question, it's absolutely fine to send it to the COI arbiter email address. What may happen is that if in fact it's a case referral, and these are questions specifically about a case, then it's what we'll need to do is ask you to fill in a case referral form, because in order to make a decision or provide advice about a specific case, we need specific information. But if you don't know whether actually your query is general or specific, it's absolutely fine to send it to the COI arbiter as a starting point. And then we'll let you know whether it's something that you actually need to make a referral about.